The dust of Oakhaven settled on the windshield of Thomas Ridge's weathered sedan like a heavy shroud of disappointment. The town, nestled deep in a forgotten valley of the Colorado Rockies, looked like it had given up the ghost 3 decades ago. Faded storefronts leaned against one another for support, and the few locals on the street watched his arrival with a mixture of suspicion and hollow apathy. Thomas had not come here for a vacation. He was here because of a letter, a final testament from a grandfather he had not spoken to in 20 years. William Ridge had passed away, leaving his only grandson an inheritance that sounded grand on paper but felt like a burden in reality. 40 acres of undeveloped land on the rocky outskirts of town. Thomas parked outside the office of David Harrison, the town's sole practicing attorney. The office smelled of stale tobacco and old paper. Harrison, the man whose wrinkles seemed etched by years of reading bad news, pushed a thin manila folder across his desk. "It's not much, Thomas," Harrison said, his voice carrying the dry rasp of the desert wind. "Your grandfather lived a quiet life. A hard life. The land is mostly shale and dead dirt. Nothing grows there, and there's no water source to speak of. I'll be completely honest with you, it's a liability." Before Thomas could open the folder, the heavy oak door of the office swung open. In walked a man who wore his wealth like a weapon. He had perfectly tailored clothes that belonged in a high-rise boardroom, not a decaying mining town. This was Gregory Stanton, the local property developer whose family had effectively owned Oakhaven for 3 generations. "Harrison?" Stanton barked, not even glancing at Thomas. "Tell me the Ridge boys signed the paperwork." "Mr. Stanton, this is Thomas," Harrison sighed, gesturing weakly. Stanton finally turned his gaze to Thomas, his eyes cold and calculating. "Listen, kid, let's not waste time. Your grandfather was a stubborn old fool who sat on useless dirt just to spite my family. I'm building a new distribution route through that valley, and your 40 acres are right in the middle of my access road. I'm prepared to offer you $50,000. That's $49,000 more than it's worth. Take the check, go back to the city, and forget Oakhaven exists." "Nay, hot." The sheer arrogance radiating from Stanton rubbed Thomas the wrong way. As a forensic accountant, Thomas dealt with wealthy bullies who hid behind corporate veils every single day. He knew the smell of desperation masked by bluster. Stanton wanted this land too badly. "I think I'll take a look at my inheritance first," Thomas said, his voice calm, sliding the folder into his briefcase. "I'll let you know if it's for sale." Stanton's face tightened. "Don't play games, Thomas. The offer expires tomorrow morning. After that, I let the county seize it for unpaid property taxes, and you get absolutely nothing." He turned on his heel and stormed out of the office. That afternoon, Thomas drove out to the property. Calling it bleak was a generous understatement. It was a jagged, unforgiving expanse of rock, dead grass, and twisted juniper trees. In the center sat a dilapidated wooden cabin that looked ready to collapse under the weight of its own history. Thomas unlocked the heavy padlock with the iron key Harrison had given him and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust. As Thomas began clearing away the old, moth-eaten blankets and rusted canned goods, he noticed something peculiar about the floorboards under the ironwood stove. They weren't nailed down flush. Prying them up, he found a heavy steel lockbox. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a hand-drawn map of the property. The journal was not a diary of a lonely old man. It was a meticulous, obsessive ledger. As Thomas turned the brittle pages, the true history of Oakhaven began to unravel. Decades ago, his grandfather, William Ridge, and Gregory Stanton's grandfather, Charles Stanton, had been business partners in a lucrative silver mining operation. But Charles was corrupt. He had embezzled millions in silver bullion, hid it, and framed William for the missing funds. William narrowly avoided prison, but his reputation was destroyed. He was forced to live as an outcast on the worst piece of land in the valley, serving as a silent watchman over a secret only he knew. Thomas looked at the final entry in the journal, written just weeks before William's death. The thief built his castle on a lie. The proof and the restitution sleeps beneath the weeping stone. I lack the power to fight the Stantons in this town. I pray you have the strength. I didn't. Night fell over the valley, painting the barren landscape in deep, ominous shadows. Suddenly, the roar of heavy engines shattered the silence. High-beam headlights flooded the cabin through the cracked windows. 3 massive pickup trucks surrounded the structure. Several men stepped out carrying heavy flashlights and crowbars. They didn't knock. They began smashing the wooden posts supporting the front porch. Thomas stayed hidden in the dark, watching through the slats. He recognized one of Stanton's foremen leading the group. They were trying to terrify him into running away before morning. They shouted threats into the night, promising that accidents happen out in the valley, before finally peeling away, leaving a thick cloud of dust in their wake. They had intended to break him. Instead, they had triggered a quiet, terrifying resolve within him. Thomas was not just going to refuse the sale. He was going to dismantle Gregory Stanton's entire empire. As dawn broke, raking the horizon in streaks of crimson and gold, Thomas took his grandfather's map and walked out to the property. He counted his paces, moving toward the western ridge where a massive, oddly shaped boulder rested, the Weeping Stone, named for the mineral streaks that looked like dark tears. Behind the boulder, obscured by decades of overgrown, thorny brush, Thomas found a depression in the earth. He grabbed a heavy iron shovel from the cabin and began to dig. For 2 hours his muscles burned and his hands blistered, but he did not stop. 3 feet down, the shovel struck something with a dull, hollow clank. He cleared the dirt away to reveal a heavy industrial steel hatch, rusted shut and secured by a massive combination dial. Thomas pulled the journal from his pocket, flicked to the back page, and inputted the sequence of numbers his grandfather had left behind. With a grinding groan of metal protesting against time, the lock gave way. Thomas pulled the hatch open. A rush of stale, metallic air escaped from the darkness below. He switched on his high-powered flashlight and descended a set of reinforced concrete stairs. He had expected a small stash, perhaps a few old documents or a hidden lockbox. What he found made his breath catch in his throat. It was a subterranean vault, shored up with heavy timber and steel beams. Stacked against the far wall were dozens of heavy wooden crates, their lids rotting away to reveal the dull, unmistakable gleam of raw silver ingots. It was the missing fortune from the Oakhaven mining boom. But that wasn't the true treasure. In the center of the room, resting on a small wooden table, was a waterproof military surplus briefcase. Thomas snapped the latches open. Inside were original bank records, signed confessions from Charles Stanton's bribed associates, and a flawless paper trail detailing exactly how the Stanton family had laundered the stolen silver through their modern real estate developments. Thomas smiled, a cold, dangerous smile. As a forensic accountant, he knew exactly what he was looking at. Gregory Stanton didn't just want the land for an access road. He had recently discovered that the stolen fortune was buried here, and he needed to retrieve it before the statute of limitations on the property taxes allowed the county to inadvertently uncover it. Thomas didn't leave the vault. He sat in the darkness, opened his laptop, connected his satellite internet relay, and went to work. For the next 3 hours, he meticulously scanned every document, traced the historical bank routing numbers to Stanton's current corporate accounts, and compiled a digital dossier so legally bulletproof it could sink a battleship. By 9 in the morning, the sound of approaching vehicles echoed from above. Thomas climbed out of the bunker, locking the hatch behind him, and walked back to the cabin. Gregory Stanton had arrived, and he wasn't alone. He had brought Sheriff Miller, a man well known in town to be comfortably resting in Stanton's back pocket, and a crew of surveyors. "Time's up, Ridge," Stanton called out, stepping out of his luxury SUV with a smug grin. "The offer is off the table. The sheriff here is executing an emergency eminent domain order for county development. You have 10 minutes to pack your trash and leave my property." Sheriff Miller rested a hand on his belt. Don't make this difficult, son. Just get in your car and drive. Ow, bop. Thomas stood on the broken porch, his arms crossed, completely unfazed. It's a funny thing about eminent domain, Mr. Stanton. It requires the county to compensate the legal owner at fair market value. And I don't think the county can afford the fair market value of what's sitting under the weeping stone. Stanton's smug grin faltered. His face drained of color. What did you say? I said, I found it, Thomas replied, his voice echoing across the silent dirt. The silver. But more importantly, I found the briefcase. Stanton took a step back, panic flashing in his eyes before turning into desperate rage. Arrest him, Miller. He's trespassing. He's stealing historical artifacts. Nah, the sheriff unclipped his radio, but before he could speak, the distant, rhythmic thumping of heavy rotors filled the air. Over the southern ridge, 2 black, unmarked tactical helicopters swept low over the valley, kicking up a massive storm of dust. At the same time, a fleet of dark SUVs with federal license plates came speeding up the dirt road, cutting off Stanton's vehicles. I didn't call the county assessor this morning, Thomas said, stepping down from the porch as heavily armed federal agents poured out of the vehicles. I called the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I sent them a 40-page encrypted file detailing a multi-generational money laundering operation, complete with original bank routing numbers that match your offshore holding companies. The Hulks. Stanton looked around, frantic, his empire crumbling into dust in a matter of seconds. You can't do this. That money belongs to my family. We built this town. You built it on stolen money and a framed man's ruined life. Thomas stepped close to Stanton, lowering his voice so only the corrupt developer could hear. My grandfather waited 50 years for justice. I'm delivering it today. Hard karma, Stanton. It always comes back around. Sheriff Miller wisely stepped away from Stanton, putting his hands in the air as federal agents swarmed the property. Stanton was forced to the hood of his own luxury vehicle, handcuffs snapping violently around his wrists. He screamed threats and obscenities, but the sound was drowned out by the rotors of the helicopters and the deafening silence of a curse being broken. In the weeks that followed, the story made national headlines. Gregory Stanton's assets were frozen, his companies liquidated, and his family's corrupt legacy was dragged into the unforgiving light of public scrutiny. The stolen silver was seized as evidence, but because of the ironclad documentation Thomas provided, the federal courts ruled that the original value, adjusted for decades of interest and damages, was rightfully owed to the estate of William Ridge. Thomas didn't keep the money for himself. He used the massive settlement to establish a trust for the town of Oak Haven. He funded a new school, rebuilt the crumbling infrastructure, and completely bought out the Stanton family's remaining properties, turning them over to the local businesses they had suppressed for decades. He thought he was just inheriting a barren patch of useless dirt. Instead, he inherited the key to dismantling a tyrant's empire and clearing a good man's name.